putting more distance between itself and the Gaza Strip. Egypt serves notice of its intention to extend a buffer zone. A reaction to concerns over security, or are there political undercurrents at play? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Fauzia Ibrahim. Egypt plans to double the size of a buffer zone along its border with the Gaza Strip. The government says the measure is intended to put an end to the movement of armed fighters and weapons from Gaza to Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. Now, the first phase of the operation began in October, days after 30 Egyptian soldiers were killed in a suicide attack on a checkpoint close to the Gaza border. Well, thousands of residents in northern Sinai were then ordered to move out. Their homes were then bulldozed and bombed. Security forces are now warning more families along the border that they're next. The buffer zone runs for around 13 kilometres along Egypt's border with the Gaza Strip. The first phase cleared an area 500 metres deep, destroying homes and tunnels used for smuggling. The security buffer is now being extended to 1 kilometre. Well, with Gaza a land under siege, Human Rights Watch has called the tunnels a lifeline to the tiny coastal strip's economy, while Amnesty International maintains that the forced evictions of families in Egypt flouts national and international law. So, is Egypt's overriding justification one of national security, or are there regional and international pressures at play? Let's now bring in our guests, all of them joining us from London. Nicholas Pierchot, Egypt researcher at Amnesty International. Wafik Mustafa is the chairman of the British Arab Network and author of the book Egypt, the Elusive Arab Spring. And completing the panel is Sharif Nashashibi, chairman and co-founder of Arab Media Watch and a journalist specializing in Arab affairs. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us. Now, this has been a continuous problem due to Egypt's porous borders, this problem of armed fighters and smuggled weapons. There's been a number of military campaigns by the Egyptian government that has waged in the past to crack down on these armed groups. The question here, Wafik Mustafa, is will this recent measure be more effective than those in the past?
I find it very difficult. Of course, I am for any measures to secure the borders of Egypt, but it could have been done with better intelligence, better policing. But demolishing homes, I feel it is political posturing. I feel there's some smokescreen here because there's a lot of big, wider issues about security, governance, good governance inside Egypt itself. So I think it will, I'm not sure if it will produce good results. It may improve the relations with Israel and probably with the United States to some extent, but how effective it will be, time will tell. But it seems to me quite smokescreen in the way.
Well, before we get on to the wider regional context of the issue, Sharif Nashashibi, how effective do you think this measure will be, this widening of this buffer zone?
I don't think it will be effective at all because it is misdiagnosing the problem. The insecurity and violence in Egypt is not caused by weapons and fighters coming from Gaza. Gaza is the least practical place for Egyptian militants to get weapons and fighters. It is surrounded by countries that are awash with weapons. It has porous borders. Gaza has been under strict blockade for several years, and as recently as this summer, Egyptian officials were boasting that 95% of tunnels were destroyed. So for various reasons, it is simply scapegoating Gaza into telling the Egyptian people that Gaza is the cause of our problems, when this is simply not the case. Only until the current authorities assumed power did we even hear of the issue of weapons and fighters coming out of Gaza. Before then, the opposite concern was being stated constantly, that it was weapons and militants coming from Sinai.
Let me just stop you there, though, Sharif. It has been said that former President Hosni Mubarak was pressured into trying to extend this buffer zone before to try to stop these smuggling tunnels as well. So you can't just say this is a recent problem. You can't just say this is a problem that this current government, Sisi, is facing.
No, it's not. I'm saying what's new about the argument is that there has to be a crackdown on weapons and fighters coming from Gaza into Sinai. Before, the pressure was to crack down on tunnels to stop weapons and fighters coming from Sinai into Gaza. Now, all of a sudden, the argument has been turned on its head to justify the evacuations of the Sinai residents. But before then, the opposite argument was being made. And until, as I said, until this summer, officials were saying that they destroyed almost all the tunnels, and the ones that are left are relatively small. They have to bring in basic supplies for an impoverished population of some 1.7 million people. That's hardly conducive to a flow of arms and fighters from Gaza. And lest we forget, why would Gaza militants be sending fighters and weapons to Egypt when they face a formidable army in Israel? They've only just been invaded by Israeli troops. Their weapon stocks are depleted. Even if the will was there, the will just wouldn't be there for Gaza to be sending militants and fighters in the other direction.
Before we further explore this political and military strategy, Nicholas Pichot, I want to bring you in here as well. The real price that's being paid here is by the residents of Rafah, those who live in that town. Now, one of them said if this measure goes through, there won't be much of Rafah left. How are they reacting to being subjected to this move, be it for political or military reasons?
Right. I mean, we have to look at the very human cost of what this operation is doing. This operation is targeting families. In the last few weeks, over 800 buildings have been destroyed and over 1,000 families have been forced from their homes. That's according to government figures. I mean, homes have been demolished, they've been blown up, and they've been reduced to rubble before their families' eyes. The few families which have resisted have been forced from their homes. In fact, one resident said that he saw a family being driven out of their home by soldiers accompanied by dogs. There's a very, very human cost to this crackdown.
At the same time, though, Nicholas, a lot of people would say that the Egyptian government does have a right to protect its own national security. And this is a measure that's definitely needed to try to stop the armed militants that are attacking their soldiers and their military.
Well, Egypt has a right and a duty to uphold, security, but it must do that in line with its human rights obligations. And Egypt is breaking international law. They've completely ignored any safeguards against forced eviction. And, they've offered just paltry compensation to the residents who have been evicted. They have to survive for the next few weeks on just $120 or so. And they've said that the money that the government has promised them to rebuild their homes won't be enough. It certainly won't be enough to rebuild their lives. I mean, we also have to look at the complete lack of notice that residents had when they were forced from their homes. Many residents we spoke to said that they only found out that they were going to be evicted by watching television. One resident said that he only found out when a bulldozer started demolishing his property. Egypt has completely flouted its international human rights obligations, and there's no excuse.
Wafik Mustafa, let's go into the political repercussions here. You had mentioned a little earlier on your first answer, you had said that there is a wider political repercussion to this. Just explain to us what that could be.
Well, if you go further than Gaza or Rafah, Sinai itself is turning into a very difficult area. How it can be controlled, the people themselves quite isolated from the rest of Egypt. And I think it's not a good picture at all, particularly supporting Suez Canal. You're talking about the governance, good governance, what was expected after the Arab Spring. The people being detained in prisons, people not have a fair trial, like Al Jazeera journalists, who must be released, and hundreds and thousands of people need to be released to have stability, to create security and to create a situation conducive to good governance.
Let me just interrupt you.
A lot of support.
Well, let me just interrupt you there, Wafik Mustafa, and say that a lot of the residents in the Sinai Peninsula have pointed to the fact that they've been marginalized for so long now. How much do you think the issue of socio-economic issues, I suppose, how much does that weigh into the fact that our militants do exist there and are fighting the Egyptian government?
It's not clear because, as we know about what happened in Sinai, the killings and incidents are reported by the government. There's no independent verification of what's exactly happening. But what we know is there is a great deal of isolation of people in Arish and other towns and villages. And we know Sinai is the size of Israel. So it's not a small place to just ignore. And it's going to affect shipping in Suez Canal. And affect Egypt itself. Egypt, there's a lot of turbulence inside the country right now, which I think it should be the priority for Egypt, not demolishing homes at Rafah and making people homeless or having difficulty as we have seen. So I think they should change their priority to focus to stabilize Egypt, to create environment, proper environment to the country and political stability.
Sharif Nashashibi, this is not, as we mentioned before, not just about Egypt's national security. There are, as we've all agreed, that there are many complex regional issues involved. Prime Minister or Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas is supporting this particular measure to try to widen this buffer zone. Why would he be weighing in on this measure?
Oh, I don't think he should be. I think it's a real shame, given the very destructive nature and consequences of the evacuations. I mean, as Nicholas pointed out, this is having a devastating effect on the residents of Sinai. And for any leader to be coming out in support of such a policy that is having such a devastating effect on a civilian population is really very shameful.
But this is also a way for him to gain some political leverage as well against Hamas, isn't it?
I suppose so, but if Abbas is interested really in implementing the national unity deal that was signed earlier this year, and which has been really very shaky from the get-go, this is not going to help his cause. So if you're talking about the need for Palestinian unity, trying to curry favor with the government in Egypt at the expense of ties with Hamas is not conducive to that whatsoever.
Wafik Mustafa, I can see you agreeing with Nashashibi there as well. You say that perhaps Palestinian Mahmoud Abbas should actually keep out of this argument?
Well, there is a turf war. There is a rivalry between the leadership on Gaza and leadership in West Bank. It is well-known secret, and each one of them trying to score on the other. That is, unfortunately, that is the real politics in that particular part of the world.
I want to take you up to Wafik Mustafa on this issue that the Egyptian government has blamed the armed group Ansar Beit al-Maqdis for many of the attacks. Now, this is a particular armed group that has recently aligned itself with ISIL, the Islamic State of Iraq, and the Levant. Is there a possibility here that we may be seeing ISIL moving into Egyptian territory?
I don't think so. I think Egyptians are very peace-loving people. I'm Egyptian myself, so I'm bound to be a bit biased. I don't think, I think it's a bit exaggerated. So I think it's exaggerated and can backfire. We need stability inside Egypt, including Sinai, and including its neighboring countries. The Middle East is changing so fast for the first time since the end of the First World War. So I think they got to look strategically how Egypt is going to develop over the next year or two.
Sharif Nashashibi, the US, Israel, the UAE and Saudi Arabia have all supported this measure that's being proposed by Egypt. This widening of the buffer zone will have huge repercussions on the region. Take us through some of those repercussions.
Well, primarily the biggest repercussion is going to be in Sinai with the displacement of this population. I think this will have huge consequences for the security situation in Egypt in general, because what is often forgotten is the long-standing grievances of the population in Sinai towards the Egyptian state. This is not about Gaza's influence on Egypt. This is about a population that has had grievances dating back to the days of Mubarak. And this will only increase the resentment and the feeling of disenfranchisement against the state, which is going to simply increase the militancy in Sinai. Now, the allegiance, pledge of allegiance from Ansar to ISIS has potential widening of widening the regional dimension. It's difficult to say how this is being affected on the ground because of the media blackout in Sinai. So it's difficult to say whether ISIS actually has a presence now in Sinai, or whether Ansar is simply using this as a propaganda ploy, allying itself with, let's say, the most prolific jihadist group in the world right now. It's difficult to say because there's a media blackout, but certainly its pledge of allegiance is going to give it a wider regional dimension that's going to, potentially bring in the involvement of many, if not most, countries in the region.
Nicholas Piachot from Amnesty International, I want to bring you back into the discussion. Do you agree with Sharif Nashashibi that this will only increase the grievances within the Sinai? And what do you make of the fact that the US is actually supporting this move?
Well, I think it's remarkable that the international community, including the US, has ignored Egypt's human rights crisis for as long as it have. I think the problem in Sinai, as the others have said, is that there's effectively a media blackout. It's very difficult to know what's going on. And I think that's helped facilitate countries like the US effectively handing the Egyptian authorities a blank check to do whatever they want in Sinai. I mean, residents are often very scared to talk to journalists or human rights activists because they're too afraid of the army. And I think we should remember that journalists who have reported what the army has done in the Sinai have actually been hauled before military courts. At the moment, the government is considering a new law which would prohibit any reporting on the army at all. And I think the real question is, if that's what the government has in mind, what is it that the army has to hide?
Wafik Mustafa, what do you think the army does have to hide?
Well, the army have a lot of questions to answer. They have to get out of politics, as simple as that, because trying to militarize Sinai as it is now is not going to be a good thing in the long-term future for Egypt as a country.
At the same time, though, there is a November 6 report that mentioned that President Sisi had ordered the Egypt's Specialized Council for Community Development to instruct the president on a comprehensive plan for an integrated urban community to achieve sustainable development for the people of Rafah on the Sinai Peninsula. Now, Wafik Mustafa, do you think this is a true aim, that he's actually going to try to develop the area, or is this just lip service?
I look forward to see the details and the costing of the project. I've always heard about a lot of projects inside Egypt, and including Sinai, but I've never seen anything tangible. I think the most important to see tangible, to see timetable and the budget. But I don't think there's anything being said about it. That's what makes me a bit doubtful if this is going to be the case.
Sharif Nashashibi, I'm just floating this idea past you. The measure that we're seeing right now to try to widen this buffer zone, could it be trying to secure the area in order to allow it to be developed in years to come?
I'm doubtful, because at the moment the propaganda coming out of the authorities in Egypt is that this is being done to stem the flow of fighters and weapons from Gaza. It is not about the development of Sinai. This simply hasn't been part of the discourse. And as long as they are misdiagnosing the reasons for the lawlessness and violence in Sinai, then this is not going to have an effect on the ground, and this is not going to improve the situation of the residents of Sinai. So I'm not very hopeful that this is any motive of the authorities in Egypt.
Nicholas Piachot, are you just as doubtful that there will be any form of development in the region?
Well, I mean, the authorities have been promising development in Egypt for many years now, but the truth is they don't care about the poor people that it's going to affect. Look at what's been happening in Cairo. We've had hundreds of families evicted earlier this year from some of the slums of Cairo, with the authorities promising that this was done in the name of development. But the truth is, you can't develop an area by kicking out the poor people. That doesn't solve the problem of poverty, it just moves it. And I think that there may be a concern that that is what's going to happen in the Sinai as well. I mean, development should be done in the name of human rights and in accordance with Egypt's obligations under international human rights law. If not, it's just another collection of fancy buzzwords that leads to nothing.
I wonder, Nicholas Pichot, now that we're seeing several hundred families, thousands of families and homes that are destroyed and families that are being displaced, is there any legal recourse that these residents can take against the Egyptian government?
I mean, the army is claiming that these people were living on army lands, and that would mean that they probably wouldn't have a legal recourse, but that's surely part of the problem. These people have lived there for many decades. Their homes were there, the schools for their children were there, and of course their businesses were there as well. What we've seen is the army wiping out almost overnight a community which has lived there and thrived there for many decades.
You say that, Nicholas Pichot. I want to bring in Wafik now and say you are unsure as to whether there are armed militants in the area that have been attacking the soldiers, which is what the Egyptian government is claiming to happen there, and this is why that they're widening this buffer zone. As Nicholas said there's been a lot of grievances there. Don't you think that this could lead to armed groups or lead to militants trying to fight back against the Egyptian government?
It certainly can backfire, because that's why I think the broader picture in Egypt is very important. Distraction or diversion tactics does not pay. It may work for a short period of time, but the very important thing in Egypt now, they have to settle the issue of rule of law, of improving the economy, making people feel confident in the government, and making the outside world as well to feel confident. And so far, I think there is a problem. So I think Sinai is not isolated from Egypt. There is 4,000 villages in Egypt that do not have a clean water or a proper sewage system. 4,000 villages. So we're talking about millions of people are really living in sub-poverty level, and Sinai is where the focus is now. So I think things are not really going in a bright way.
The problem here, Sharif Nashashibi, is that it does seem as if, and you mentioned there's a media blackout, so we don't really know what is happening in the Sinai Peninsula, but all we can tell is from what the Egyptian government is telling the rest of the world. Now, the Egyptian government says, we are facing armed groups. We are trying to stop smuggled weapons here, and we need to do this for our own national security. What then would you suggest would be the alternative?
Firstly, the authorities should be held accountable by citizens, by the media, by human rights groups. None of this is taking place. The government, the army, is doing as it pleases under a media blackout where protests are banned. I mean, these are not the actions of a government that legitimately wants to deal with the myriad problems facing Egypt. This is completely the wrong way to go about it. And I think what's going to be interesting, I don't believe this buffer zone is going to bring peace and order and security to Egypt. It's going to be interesting when that happens. What next will the government blame this problem on? I mean, you have a government that's pledged to fight this violence, lawlessness, under a president who has a military background. This is very embarrassing for the government. And when it finds that this buffer zone hasn't fixed the problem, what is going to be its next scapegoat when it cannot blame Gaza or the wider issue of foreign meddling?
Wafik Mustafa, do you agree that the government might be running out of reasons to extend its military arm, shall we say?
Yes, certainly human rights is a big issue, as we know, about how about 200 people have been sentenced to death a few days ago. I think there's a lot of issues. I think the rule of law need to be implemented properly, and I call upon President Sisi to really look seriously about how Egypt is going to develop over the next 12 months, because things cannot go on. We cannot just have political posturing all the time. Egypt is sinking as a country, politically, economically, and in the eye of the international world.
Gentlemen, we're going to have to leave the discussion there. We thank you so very much for your time. Thank you to Nicholas Piachot, Wafik Mustafa and Sharif Nashashibi. And why not add your voice to this discussion? You can always post your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or you can contact us on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. I'm Fauzia Ibrahim. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.